Jake trudged through the snow, his boots crunching with each step. The cold was unbearable, stinging his skin with every gust of wind. He had been traveling through the barren wasteland of this remote Earth colony for days, his mission simple but harsh: survey the area, take notes, and leave. But with the storm rolling in, Jake's plans quickly shifted from exploration to survival. His breath came in short puffs, forming clouds of vapor in the freezing air. The dense snowstorm blurred everything around him, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The wind howled as it whipped across the vast, empty landscape. It was the kind of cold that could freeze a person's bones, and Jake had learned to respect it. He had to finish his survey quickly and return to the warmth of the shelter. But as he turned back to head toward his base, something strange caught his attention. A voice, faint, distant, and almost drowned by the howling wind. Jake paused, his senses on high alert. His eyes scanned the snowy horizon, trying to find the source of the sound. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him. But then, it came again. "Please, let me in. I'm freezing." It was a woman's voice, weak and desperate. The words were barely audible, but there was no mistaking the urgency in them. Jake's heart skipped a beat. In this harsh environment, a person stranded in the storm wouldn't last long. No one should be out here in this freezing cold, unless they were in trouble. He took a deep breath and followed the sound, his instincts telling him to help, even if it was risky. He made his way through the thick snow, each step feeling heavier than the last. The voice grew louder, guiding him forward. As he neared a small rocky outcrop, he saw her. A figure was kneeling on the ground, struggling to stand, her thin body shaking violently against the cold. Her clothes were tattered, and her skin had a strange bluish tint to it. She looked alien. Jake's heart raced, but he didn't hesitate. The desperation in her voice struck him deeply, and his survival instincts told him she needed help, no matter who or what she was. "Hey," Jake shouted over the wind. "Are you okay?" The woman's eyes snapped open, her gaze locking with his. There was something haunting about her eyes, large, bright, and full of fear. She took a trembling step toward him, her voice weak but filled with desperation. "Please, I can't. I'll die out here. I beg you. Let me in." Her plea hit Jake harder than he expected. The sight of a person, a stranger, in such a desperate state was difficult to ignore. Despite the confusion and fear bubbling inside him, Jake knew what he had to do. He wasn't the type to turn his back on someone in need. Quickly, he moved toward her, careful not to make any sudden movements. As he reached out to steady her, the woman's weight collapsed into his arms. She was light, almost fragile, and the chill of her body sent a shock through Jake's spine. He gritted his teeth, his muscles straining as he lifted her, supporting her trembling form. "Hang on," Jake muttered, his voice rough with concern. "I'll get you to safety." The wind continued to howl as Jake carried the alien woman back toward his shelter. Her face was pale, and her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She was freezing, her body barely able to hold on to any warmth. Her hands, when she reached out to him, were icy to the touch. Every instinct told him to be cautious, but he ignored it. She needed help. As they reached the entrance of his shelter, Jake quickly fumbled with the door controls, his fingers numb from the cold. He finally managed to open the door, and with one last effort, he carried the woman inside. The warmth of the shelter hit them both like a wave, but the woman remained limp in his arms. Jake laid her down on a makeshift cot, his mind racing. She wasn't from Earth, that much was clear. Her features were too different. Her skin had an unusual texture, her eyes too large, her hair a soft shade of silver. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was getting her warm and alive. As he moved to gather supplies to help, the woman's eyes fluttered open again. She reached out weakly, her voice trembling as she whispered, I can repay you. Anything. Just don't leave me." Jake glanced at her, unsure of how to respond. She was clearly in shock, and her words made little sense. Still, he nodded, not knowing what else to do. She was an alien, but at this moment, that didn't matter. Her words echoed in his mind. I can repay you. He couldn't help but wonder, what kind of reward could someone like her offer? But there was no time to dwell on it. The storm outside raged on, and inside, Jake had a more pressing task, keeping her alive. Jake paced back and forth in his shelter, the heat from the fire slowly thawing his frozen limbs. He glanced at the alien woman, Lyra, lying on the cot. Her breathing had slowed, and the violent shivering that had racked her body earlier was beginning to subside. The storm outside still raged, but inside the shelter it was quiet. Too quiet. He sat down on a nearby chair, staring at her. She didn't look like anything he had ever seen before. Her skin was a soft shade of silver, her long hair shimmering with an almost ethereal glow. Her eyes, large and almond-shaped, still carried an unreadable expression even as she slept. Her features were delicate, but there was a certain strength about her that Jake couldn't quite place. He tried to focus on what he needed to do next. He couldn't afford to be distracted. The storm outside had trapped him here, and while that meant he couldn't leave, it also meant that Lyra was stuck with him. They were both stranded, isolated in a world so cold and dangerous that it seemed like everything was trying to kill them. But as much as he wanted to think of his survival, his mind kept returning to Lyra. What was she really? Where had she come from? Hours passed, and Lyra finally stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she gazed up at Jake, still looking lost, as if unsure of where she was. She blinked a few times, then tried to sit up, but her body was still weak from the cold. Jake quickly stood and moved to her side, offering his help. "Take it easy," he said softly, his voice calm. "You're safe here. You've been out in the cold for too long. You need to rest." Lyra didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked around, taking in the small, humble shelter. Then her gaze returned to Jake, and she spoke, her voice hoarse but full of quiet desperation. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved me." Jake nodded, trying to remain composed, though something in her voice made him uneasy. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of gratitude and something else, something deeper. A sense of urgency. "You were freezing out there," Jake said. "What happened? How did you end up in this storm?" Lyra hesitated, and for a moment Jake wondered if she would even answer. But then she looked at him, her expression turning serious. "My ship, it crashed," she said slowly. "I'm from far away. My people, my planet, they've been at war. My ship was hit, and I barely escaped. I was trying to make contact, to find a way to survive. But Earth, it's so different. I didn't know how to prepare for this." Jake frowned, feeling a mixture of concern and curiosity. The words didn't quite make sense. A war? A planet so far away. He had heard stories of alien encounters, but this felt different. Lyra wasn't some invader or aggressor. She was lost, stranded just like him. And yet, there was something powerful about her presence, something Jake couldn't explain. "Your planet's at war," Jake repeated, his voice quiet. "And you came here alone?" Lyra nodded. "Yes. I had to leave. There was no other choice. My people were being hunted, one by one. I don't know if they'll survive. I'm one of the last. I had to find somewhere safe. And I thought, maybe Earth could help." Jake felt a strange weight in her words. She didn't sound like someone who had come to conquer or invade. She sounded like someone who had lost everything. A survivor, just like him. He sat back, processing what she had said. "So, Earth, you think it can help?" Jake asked, unsure of how to respond. Lyra's gaze dropped, and she seemed to shrink in on herself. "I don't know," she whispered. "I had hoped to make contact, but now, I don't even know if I can repair my ship. I'm alone." The silence hung in the air between them for a moment. Jake could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. She was alone. Completely alone. He understood that feeling more than anything. It was what he had been trying to escape when he set out on this mission. To get away from the isolation, the silence. But now, here they were, two strangers caught in a storm, facing an uncertain future. Jake stood up and moved over to the small table where his supplies were stored. He grabbed a few things, a blanket, some food, and a medical kit. Then he returned to Lyra's side, offering them to her. "I'll help you," Jake said firmly. "I'll help you get your ship fixed. You don't have to be alone." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes full of surprise. Then, slowly, a small smile appeared on her face. A smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but it was a smile nonetheless. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how to repay you, but I will. I promise." Jake smiled back, though there was a part of him that didn't fully trust her words. She was an alien after all. But as the storm raged outside, and Lyra's warmth spread through the shelter, Jake realized that sometimes trust was all they had left, and he wasn't ready to turn his back on her. Not yet. The days that followed were a strange mixture of silence and effort. The storm outside never seemed to let up, and Jake spent most of his time inside the shelter, working with Lyra to figure out a plan. He still didn't fully understand her situation, but one thing was clear: her ship was in no condition to fly anytime soon. It had been damaged beyond repair, and while Lyra was intelligent, she was still learning about Earth's technology. They were both stuck here. Lyra had grown stronger with each passing day. The cold no longer shook her body, and her breathing was steady. She was still a mystery to Jake, but he couldn't deny the bond that had started to form between them. They shared stories, swapped knowledge about their worlds, and as the days dragged on, Jake began to feel less like a rescuer and more like a friend. The strange part was how Lyra acted. At times, she seemed so different from the humans Jake knew, but in other ways, she was almost familiar. There was an innocence in her eyes when she spoke about her planet, a quiet sorrow that mirrored something deep inside Jake. He knew that feeling well, being lost, searching for a place to belong. One evening, as they sat by the small fire in the shelter, Lyra turned to Jake, her face unusually serious. "Jake, there is something I must tell you," she said softly. He looked up, concerned. "What is it?" Lyra hesitated, and Jake could see the struggle in her eyes. "You've helped me more than anyone ever has. I can't repay you in the way you might expect, but there is something I can give you, something that might make things easier for both of us." Jake frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Lyra slowly reached into a small pouch at her side, pulling out a strange glowing object. It looked like a tiny crystal, humming with energy. She held it up between them, and the light from the fire reflected off of it in a dazzling display of colors. "This is from my home planet," she explained, her voice low. "It's called a Hearthian stone. It holds immense power. It can heal, it can energize, and it can give you strength." Jake didn't know what to say. He stared at the glowing crystal, captivated by its otherworldly glow. He could feel something inside it, some sort of energy that pulled at him, as if it recognized him. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. "Why are you giving this to me?" Jake asked, still unsure. "Isn't it important to you?" Lyra nodded. "It is, but you need it more than I do. You've done more for me than I could have ever hoped for. This stone has the power to heal injuries, to restore energy. It will help you survive, in case the storm doesn't end soon." Jake looked at the stone again, feeling a sense of gratitude mixed with confusion. Why would she offer him such a powerful gift? They weren't even from the same world. Yet there was something genuine in her eyes, something that told him she wasn't lying. She really wanted to help. "I don't know what to say," Jake murmured. "You don't have to do this. I'm just trying to help you." Lyra's gaze softened, and she reached out to gently place the stone in his palm. You have already helped me more than you know. I couldn't have made it through the storm without you. I can't repay you in gold or riches, but this is the best I can offer. Jake closed his hand around the crystal, feeling the warmth of its energy pulse against his skin. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He couldn't quite explain it, but it felt like the stone had unlocked something inside him, something he had forgotten he needed. Thank you, Lyra, Jake said, his voice quiet but sincere. I don't know what the future holds, but I'll do my best to help you get back to your people. Lyra smiled, a soft, genuine smile that seemed to light up the room. Thank you, Jake. You've given me more than just survival. You've given me hope. The two of them sat in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. Jake looked at the stone in his hand, still unsure of how to use it, but trusting that it would reveal its purpose in time. He had no idea what kind of power the Hearthian stone held, but something deep inside told him that Lyra was right. It could change everything. As the night wore on, Jake found himself thinking about the future, about what would happen once the storm finally passed. Would they be able to fix her ship? Would Lyra be able to return home? Or would they be trapped here on this desolate planet forever? But for the first time since the storm began, Jake felt like he wasn't alone. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The days grew longer, and the storm continued its relentless assault on the planet's surface. Jake and Lyra had settled into a routine, each day blurring into the next. The small shelter was warm, and the fire crackled steadily, offering some comfort from the cold winds outside. Despite the constant storm, the two of them found a strange peace in the quiet companionship they shared. Jake had spent more time studying the Hearthian stone, holding it close whenever he could. There was something magnetic about it. He couldn't explain it, but whenever his fingers touched the smooth surface, he felt a pulse of energy flow through him. It wasn't painful, just powerful. It made him feel more alive, more alert, like his senses were sharper, his body stronger. He hadn't told Lyra yet, but the stone was changing him. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. He had been tired, worn down by the cold and the isolation. But now, he was sure, the energy from the stone was affecting him in ways he couldn't fully understand. One afternoon, while Lyra rested in the corner of the shelter, Jake decided to test the stone's power. He stood by the fire, holding the stone in his palm. He concentrated on it, willing himself to understand what it could do. Suddenly, there was a faint hum, and the stone began to glow. It wasn't just the soft light he had seen before. It was a deep, intense glow, like the heart of the sun. Jake felt a rush of warmth, and his muscles seemed to relax, as though the energy was spreading through his body, soothing him in ways he couldn't describe. His vision sharpened, and the cold air that had always made his skin crawl now felt bearable. Jake. Lyra's voice broke his concentration, and he turned to see her watching him from across the room. She looked concerned but also curious. He lowered the stone, the glow fading, but the warmth still lingered inside him. "Are you all right?" she asked, her eyes wide with concern. Jake nodded, a grin spreading across his face. "Yeah, I think I'm more than all right." Lyra stood slowly, her expression unreadable. "You're using the stone, aren't you?" Jake hesitated. He had been keeping his experiments with the stone to himself. He didn't want to worry Lyra, not when things were already so complicated. But now that she had caught him, he couldn't lie. "I think so," Jake admitted. "I've been holding it, trying to understand it. It feels different. I can feel its power, Lyra." She approached cautiously, her gaze intense. The Hearthian stone is a very powerful artifact. It was meant to heal, to restore, and to energize. But it's also dangerous if misused. You must be careful. Jake looked at her, suddenly feeling the weight of her warning. He had never considered that the stone might be harmful, He had assumed it was just a gift, a token of gratitude. But Lyra's words made him pause. The stone might not be as simple as it seemed. I didn't mean to do anything wrong, Jake said, his voice sincere. I thought it could help. The cold, everything. I didn't realize it could be dangerous. Lyra nodded, her eyes softening. It's not that the stone is dangerous, but its power is not something to be taken lightly. It comes from a place of great energy, a force that can heal, but also harm if used too recklessly. Jake looked down at the stone, holding it between his hands. The glow was faint now, almost imperceptible, but he could still feel its warmth radiating from within. He wondered what else it could do. I didn't mean to cause trouble, he said, looking back at Lyra. But I can feel something from it. I feel stronger, like I can take on anything. Lyra watched him for a moment before speaking again. The stone reacts to its holder. It can enhance your abilities, your energy. But be careful. If you use it too much, you might burn yourself out. It feeds off of your willpower. And if you're not careful, it will drain you. Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had never dealt with something like this before. The stone was incredible, but it also carried risks. It seemed to hold the key to his survival, but at what cost? I understand, Jake said, his voice steady. I'll be careful. Lyra smiled faintly, nodding. Good, but I'm glad you're learning about its power. We'll need it, Jake. We have to find a way to survive here until the storm passes. Jake stood up and walked toward her, the stone still in his hand. I'll do whatever it takes, Lyra. We'll get through this. Together. As they exchanged a quiet glance, something unspoken passed between them. A bond formed not just by survival, but by the shared understanding that they were both far from home. Together, they might just have a chance. The storm outside howled louder than ever, but inside the shelter, Jake and Lyra felt something else. Hope. They had each other, and the power of the stone to guide them. The storm had not let up. Each day, the winds howled louder, and the cold seemed to seep into every corner of their small shelter. Jake and Lyra had learned to adjust, finding small ways to stay comfortable. They used the fire as much as they could, and Lyra had even started to fashion small tools from the resources they could find around the shelter. She was resourceful, an alien with knowledge and skills that amazed Jake, and yet in some ways, she was like him. They were both survivors, doing their best to get by in a world that seemed to want to swallow them whole. The energy from the Hearthian stone had started to make a noticeable difference in Jake. He felt stronger, more alert, and even the gnawing hunger in his stomach didn't seem as bad. But there were side effects too. He had noticed that when he used the stone too much, his body would feel drained, as if the energy it provided was a gift with a hidden cost. Still, the stone remained their greatest hope. One evening, as the two sat by the fire, Lyra spoke up, her voice steady but serious. Jake, we can't keep waiting for the storm to pass. We need to think of a way to leave this place. Jake looked up from the fire, meeting her eyes. He had been thinking about this a lot lately, but he hadn't found the right words. It was one thing to survive the storm, but another to think beyond it. They were stranded, far from any civilization, and it was clear that Lyra's ship wouldn't be fixed anytime soon. It had been damaged badly, and even with all the stone's energy, it wasn't enough to repair it on their own. I know, Jake said, his voice low. But how? You saw what condition the ship is in. It's not just the weather. It's everything. We can't just wish it into working again. Lyra nodded, her face thoughtful. I know, but we have to try. There must be something we can do. Jake shifted uncomfortably, knowing she was right. The longer they stayed here, the harder it would be to escape. They needed a plan, and they needed it soon. They couldn't rely on the storm passing alone. They needed to take action. I've been thinking, Jake began, about the resources we have. The shelter's holding up for now, but it's not a long-term solution. And the ship, even if we could get it running, we need fuel, parts. We don't have much. Lyra stood up, brushing the dust off her clothes. Maybe we can find some of those things outside. I've seen strange structures in the distance, places where I think the local resources might be. We could look for them, see if we can find anything useful. Jake felt a spark of hope. Are you sure they're not dangerous? I mean, we don't know what's out there. Lyra glanced outside, her eyes narrowing. I don't know, but I've seen them from the ship. These structures, they looked like abandoned ruins. If we could get to them, maybe there's something inside we can use. Jake weighed her words carefully. It was risky, but they didn't have many options. Staying in the shelter would only delay the inevitable, and the stone, while powerful, wasn't going to be enough to fix everything. If we're going to do this, we need a plan, Jake said. We can't just rush out there and hope for the best. We need to know what we're walking into. Lyra nodded in agreement. We'll take it slow. We don't know what's out there, but we have the stone. It will help guide us. I believe we can make it. The idea of venturing outside into the unknown made Jake's stomach tighten with nerves, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was their only chance. The storm would not last forever, but if they didn't find a way to survive, it wouldn't matter. They had to act. We'll leave at first light, Jake decided. We'll pack what we can carry, and we'll head for the structures. It's the best chance we got. Lyra smiled, a look of determination in her eyes. Agreed. We'll make it, Jake. I know we will. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jake allowed himself to feel a little less burdened. They had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And that something was all they had. They would face whatever challenges came next together. As the fire crackled softly, they prepared themselves for the journey ahead. They had no idea what awaited them out there, but for the first time in days, hope filled their hearts. The storm outside continued to rage, but within the shelter, something had changed. Together, they would find a way to survive. And maybe, just maybe, they would find a way to get Lyra back to her people. The first light of day broke through the thick clouds, casting a soft glow over the land. The storm had not stopped, but the winds had softened, and the freezing cold seemed to ease just a little. Jake and Lyra had packed what little they could carry, mostly supplies from the shelter, the Hearthian stone, and a few tools Lyra had managed to fashion from scrap metal. They were ready. I think we're as ready as we'll ever be, Jake said, adjusting the straps on his pack. He could feel the weight of the stone pressing against his side, a constant reminder of how much depended on this journey. Lyra, already standing by the door of the shelter, gave him a nod. We have no choice but to move forward. Let's go. Jake took a deep breath and stepped out into the cold, the crunch of snow beneath his boots the only sound in the still air. The landscape before them was harsh and desolate. Towering trees, their branches heavy with snow, lined the edges of the small clearing around their shelter. Beyond that, the forest stretched into the distance, filled with shadows and uncertainty. As they moved deeper into the forest, the wind began to pick up again, howling through the trees. The snow whipped at their faces, and Jake pulled his collar up higher to shield himself from the cold. Despite the discomfort, he kept moving forward, each step taking him farther from the safety of the shelter. Lyra walked beside him, her eyes scanning the surroundings, ever watchful. After a few hours of walking, they reached a small hill. At the top, they could see the ruins Lyra had mentioned. They were not far off now, but as they neared, Jake's unease grew. The ruins seemed ancient, as though they had been abandoned for centuries. The stone walls were cracked, and strange symbols were etched into them, symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Lyra paused, her eyes narrowing as she studied the ruins. This is it, she said softly. These structures were once part of a great city, but now, it's just a relic. Jake looked at the ruins, his heart pounding in his chest. Do you think we can find anything useful here? "I hope so," Lyra replied, her voice steady but filled with a hint of worry. "There might be old technology we can use, or materials to help repair the ship. But we have to be careful. We don't know what else might be inside." Jake nodded, gripping the stone tightly in his hand. The warmth from it spread through his fingers, offering a sense of reassurance. It was strange how comforting the stone had become. It had already shown its power, and he trusted it now, though he still didn't fully understand it. As they entered the ruins, the air seemed to change. It was colder here, the walls of stone absorbing what little warmth the sun offered. The hallway stretched before them, dark and silent. Lyra led the way, her steps cautious, as if expecting something to jump out at any moment. Jake followed close behind, his hand never far from the stone. The walls were covered with more symbols, the same glowing markings Jake had noticed earlier. They pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of the ruins themselves. He could feel something in the air, a strange energy that seemed to hum beneath the surface. "We need to find the main chamber," Lyra said, her voice low. "That's where the most valuable resources are likely to be stored." Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the dark corridors. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became. The only sound was their breathing and the faint crackling of the firestone, still glowing gently in Jake's hand. After what seemed like an eternity, they'd reached the central chamber of the ruins. It was larger than they had expected, the ceiling stretching high above them. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it, a glowing crystal. It was not like the Harthian stone. This crystal was massive, almost otherworldly in its design, with light flickering from within its core. "This is it," Lyra whispered, her voice filled with awe. "This crystal could power the ship, Jake. It's the energy source we've been searching for." Jake took a cautious step forward, but as he did, the ground beneath him shifted. A low rumble echoed through the chamber, and Jake froze. The walls began to tremble, and a dark figure emerged from the shadows. It was a creature, tall and covered in shadows, its eyes glowing with a fierce red light. The air around them seemed to grow colder still as it approached. Lyra grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him back. "We need to go now." But Jake stood still, the power of the Harthian stone humming through him. He could feel its energy rising, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid. Whatever this creature was, he was ready to face it. The creature in front of Jake and Lyra was enormous, its body made of shifting shadows that seemed to blur with the darkness of the ruins. Its red eyes glowed, piercing through the dim light like two burning embers. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air was thick with tension. Jake's heart raced in his chest, but he didn't feel fear. Instead, he felt the warmth of the Harthian stone, a power within him that surged with every heartbeat. "We need to leave," Lyra whispered urgently, tugging at Jake's arm. But Jake shook his head, his grip tightening around the stone. "No," he said, his voice firm. "We have to face it." Lyra stared at him, wide-eyed. She didn't understand. But Jake knew something she didn't. The stone had given him strength, and now it was giving him a sense of purpose. They couldn't back down. Not now. Not when they were so close to finding a way home. The creature took a step forward, its long limbs stretching out toward them. Jake instinctively stepped in front of Lyra, his body tense but resolute. The Harthian stone in his hand pulsed with a bright light, filling the room with an almost blinding glow. The creature hissed, its mouth opening to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth, but instead of attacking, it paused. The air around it seemed to shimmer, as if it was evaluating Jake, searching for something. Jake didn't back away. He couldn't, not after everything they had been through. "What do you want?" Jake asked, his voice steady. The creature's eyes narrowed, and for a long moment there was silence. Then, in a low, growling voice, it spoke. "The crystal belongs to us." Jake felt a rush of anger. He had been through too much to let this thing take their only chance at survival. Without the crystal, They couldn't fix the ship. Without the ship, they couldn't get home. No, Jake said, his voice stronger this time. This crystal is ours. It will help us leave this place. The creature hissed again, but this time there was something else in its eyes, something like uncertainty. It stepped back slightly, as if considering Jake's words. Lyra, still behind him, took a deep breath. Jake, what are you doing? We don't know what this creature is. It could destroy us. Jake didn't take his eyes off the creature. I know what I'm doing. The stone has shown me. This is the way. We can't run anymore. It's time to fight. He raised the Harthian stone higher, feeling its energy pour through him. The light from the stone grew brighter, illuminating the entire chamber. The creature recoiled slightly, its form flickering like a shadow in the light. It seemed afraid. Suddenly, the stone flared with intense heat. The creature roared, its red eyes flashing with rage. But instead of charging, it seemed to retreat. The shadows around it thickened, swirling and twisting like smoke in the wind. The creature was struggling, as if the light from the stone was too much for it to handle. Jake held his ground, his focus on the creature. Leave. Now. The creature let out one final roar, a terrible echoing sound that seemed to shake the walls of the ruins. Then, with a final flicker of its red eyes, it vanished into the shadows. The air grew still again, and the faint light from the Harthian stone began to dim. Jake exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. It was over. The creature was gone. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. You did it. You scared it off. Jake lowered the stone, his body exhausted from the surge of energy, but a feeling of triumph filled him. It wasn't just me. The stone, it gave me the strength. Lyra smiled, a look of relief on her face. We have it. The crystal is ours. We can go home. Jake turned to look at the massive crystal on the pedestal. It was glowing brightly now, its energy pulsing with life. With it, they had everything they needed to repair the ship. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time in days, they could see a way forward. Let's get back to the shelter, Jake said, his voice calm. We've got work to do. Together, they left the ruins, their hearts full of hope. The storm outside had not stopped, but it no longer mattered. They had what they needed to survive. And now, they had a plan. They would fix the ship, leave this place, and find their way home. Jake and Lyra walked back into the cold, but they were no longer afraid. They had faced the unknown, and they had won. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they knew they could face them together.